Do you need help purchasing your car insurance? Head on over to AutoDeal.com.ph/car-insurance. Here, you can compare prices and customize your insurance coverage from many of the Philippines' top providers. When you've selected the insurance that's best for you, simply fill out the application and complete the transaction with ease through Visa, MasterCard, GCash, GrabPay, or PayPal, and receive your policy within the next business day. Get the best deal on insurance with AutoDeal. I rarely miss out on the opportunity of finding myself beside a brand new car, especially when it launches. But in the case of the Honda HR-V, Honda was nice enough to invite us. Unfortunately, I missed out on it because, well, we were busy doing other things. But we do have a behind the desk on this 2022 Honda HR-V and its variants as well. And if you haven't seen it, click right here. Now, in that video, we describe, well, the differences between the turbo and the non-turbo. So today, I'm going to describe the differences between this and the previous generation, as well as touch on some topics, including the biggest difference between the non-turbo and the turbo version, which is, I'm sure you can figure it out in your head, is not just the price, but also the engine. So first, let's start off with the fact that it has actually grown up. In the sense of growing up, I mean it has become much, much bigger. Now, in the sense, when you compare it to the previous generation HR-V, this area right here looks like it has lengthened itself, doesn't it? It doesn't necessarily look so small and compact and young anymore. It looks like, well, like I said, it's grown up. Unlike me, it's actually grown a little bit in length. Not girth, let's not even go there. But anyway, yeah, the fact is, the previous generation HR-V, well, you could liken it more to, like, say, the CX-3. It was tiny, it was powerful with a 1.8-liter engine. The CX-3 was a 2-liter engine, and it was quite a bit on the expensive side, roughly about 1,450,000 Philippine pesos. The good news is, it's actually gotten cheaper, even though the car has gotten bigger. How much bigger? Well, in terms of wheelbase, this car is actually closer to that of the Toyota Corolla Cross. Yes, it's only roughly about an inch shorter in terms of wheelbase. So really, that's how big it is. That's exactly what I wanted to convey to you, that the changes from this in terms of size-wise and what the car offers exteriorly, if that's even a term, in change, or rather the difference between this and the previous generation HR-V. Now, while this isn't exactly a complete behind the wheel, and it's obviously not a behind the desk, this is, well, I hate to say hybrid, but that's exactly what it is, sort of like a hybrid and in between. And speaking of hybrid, the reason why I mention it is because, well, there are two versions of the HR-V. There's a turbo and a non-turbo. And just like our comparison that we did for the Toyota Corolla Cross, where we compared the hybrid and non-hybrid, there we discussed whether the price that you would pay over the non-hybrid would be worth it. And we came up with a conclusion, and if you haven't seen that video, do click right here. In the same sense that this is actually just as important, that topic is actually just as important when you're talking about the HR-V, because the price difference between this HR-V and the turbo, this is the turbo version, and the lower variant is roughly 350,000 Philippine pesos. Now, what I can tell you the differences between the S and the V being the top end, is that inside you've got leather. That's probably the main difference that it has on the other automobile, or rather the S variant. Leather is one. The color of the wheels is one. A little change in the bumper and the front grille. Roughly, aesthetically, it's very difficult to tell them apart. I mean, even the size of the wheels are exactly the same. Now, I bring this up because, and I brought up the Toyota Corolla Cross, was because the difference between those two cars, when I'm talking about the Toyota Corolla Cross, is that there was a lot. There was technology inside, leather inside, even charging points and air vents inside. Here, there's barely any difference. The big change, and I do mean the real big, not change, but difference between the S and the V, is what's sitting under the hood. And that is ridiculously important. This, my friends, this is the biggest difference between the S and the V, this V, the turbo variant. See, in the S, you get the same 1.5-liter engine. In fact, in the S, it produces roughly about 120 horses and 145 newton meters of torque, which, to be honest with you, it hasn't been much, and I've been driving that around. I'll explain that a little bit later. But in this V variant, which is 350,000 Philippine pesos more expensive, you get a 1.5 liter with a turbo that produces, get this, more than 170 horses and 240 Newton meters of torque. If that sounds familiar to you, it's because this engine is what you can find in a Civic. And man, this engine pulls. And I'm not talking about like Johnny Depp pulls. Actually, I do mean like Johnny Depp pulls, but this thing really does pull. And you can feel the difference in power. And my goodness, is it worth the price though? Let's go for a drive and I'll explain that. In terms of comfort, it's similar to the previous generation, which is to say that, well, the steering is, Honda's gotten it right, your seating position is actually pretty good, and your field of vision is quite good as well. Comfort for the driver and the passenger up front is good, but it's not just limited up here. In the back as well. I felt as if on the drive to about over 160 kilometers one way to our destination, up Tagaytay and eventually to Anilao, I was actually pretty comfortable in the back where I was able to snooze. However, I will say this, that for taller passengers such as Jack, who's close to about 6 feet tall, about twice my body size, it wasn't an issue of him being comfortable in the back when it comes to elbow room, and it was him and me at the back. The issue was that his headroom was actually kind of compromised. Now, like I said, Jack is a little bit shy of 6 feet tall. So in that regard, it's good to be a small person like me. No, I'm just kidding. It's just, it would be better for taller passengers to sit up front, whereas smaller passengers will have no issues whatsoever at the rear. Now, when it comes to creature comfort of, let's say, this particular model, which is the turbo and the non-turbo, well, some of the things that you will feel is that there is leather inside the automobile, and that obviously inside the turbo, it's a bit more supple. It just feels good to the touch. Even on hot days such as this, when you've got the air pumping and going, it actually is nice because it feels more premium. It truly does. Although I will say that there is a tendency inside the leather seats to be a little bit more on the stiffer side. Stiffer doesn't necessarily mean bad, because it just basically gives you more support. Then there are quite tiny additions in the fact that here inside the turbo, there are actually charging points for the rear. That's the odd thing. In the rear of the turbo, there are air vents, and then in the non-turbo, there are also air vents as well. So it's actually very similar. Same center armrest, same cup holders on the doors and whatnot. It's just a matter of charging points. And really, today, in this day and age where almost everybody has a mobile phone or some sort of device that needs a little bit of juice every once in a while, you'd think that they could have at least put charging points in the back, but they didn't. So you actually have to spend an extra 360,000 Philippine pesos or 350,000 Philippine pesos to get chargers at the rear. I'm not sure if that's exactly true, but the way that I framed it, but if you think about it, yeah, right? Now, the ride is quite similar to that of the previous generation, albeit I'd say that it's gotten just a wee tamer. Like its exterior, it's grown up a little bit, it's got a little bit more. So the ride in this particular generation, both for turbo and non-turbo, compared to the previous generation, is actually, it's a bit smoother, I should say. The odd thing though is, I need to point this out because you'll see it when you're standing away from the automobile, is that when you're a good maybe 5-10 feet away from the car, you'll notice that underneath, only the turbo variant, there is a silencer underneath, or like the first of 2 mufflers underneath to keep the engine as quiet as possible. And that's only found on the turbo variant. It does diminish the ground clearance by ever so little. In the non-turbo, your ground clearance is 198 millimeters. Inside this turbo, the ground clearance is 181 millimeters. The ride height is still the same. The ground clearance is just a little different. So you're talking about a total of about 17 millimeters, which is about 0.6 of an inch. It isn't much. No, nothing at all. It's barely anything. It's just that it looks just a bit off. The biggest difference, however, from the S and V is the fact that, well, you're paying 350,000 Philippine pesos for a turbo, and that much torque and power that comes with it. And it's really quite a lot, especially since we were able to experience both automobiles. We were 4 passengers inside the non-turbo, 2 passengers roughly about the size of Jack, including height, I might add, and then 2 passengers that were my size. And during the hills of Tagaytay Highlands, it was having, well, truth be told, it was having a little bit of a hard time trying to get through the ups. Not the downs, but the ups, really. And then we took this car that we have right now, which is the turbo, and the difference, truth be told, is really night and day. So that is definitely where your money is being spent. After all, you're getting a car that has essentially the engine of a Civic. Bam! It's also worth mentioning that even though the turbo has more torque and more horsepower, it's actually a bit more fuel efficient. Now, we were driving both models out of town over about, 200 kilometers? And we found that, well, they're mostly highway figures, that the non-turbo was doing roughly about 12 kilometers per liter. Funny enough, the turbo was doing 14 kilometers per liter. That is, however, not to say that the non-turbo will not cater to a specific audience. It still will, in the sense that, sure, it's not as powerful as the turbo, and like I mentioned, it did have a hard time when it was traveling through the hills of Tagaytay. But really, as a city runabout, it's actually still quite peppy. You don't necessarily have hills inside the city, do you? Unless you live in, like, Switzerland. Heading back into the city, which we are now stuck in traffic, it has come to my attention that obviously the naturally aspirated HRV will also serve a very large market, because not everybody is going to be taking the car out of town all the time and needs all that power. So there is definitely a very large market for it. My personal preference, however, if it were just me, definitely the turbo. Any day of the week and twice on Sunday.